So China has been given the blessing and the curse of being one of the largest energy consumers and most rapidly growing energy consumers over the last decade. And so that comes with some significant benefits and some significant drawbacks, one of which is trying to procure enough energy to keep your rapid economic growth going. So energy in China is a big business and a big deal. China imports probably 60% of the oil that it consumes. It's the world's largest oil importer as of about 2014. But it has been doing a lot to make sure that its energy consumption across a range of fuels is more secure and quite frankly, affordable and reliable, which are equally as important as secure. It's been doing a few things. The first is increasing its production domestically to the extent possible. China has some, on the natural gas side, has some pretty impressive unconventional shale gas resources. It's been moving into its own offshore to produce more oil and gas. It's also been looking to diversify its imports, especially on the oil and natural gas side, from a variety of different sources. When you look at the ways in which China has worked to make sure it has multiple pipelines coming into the country from both an oil and gas side of the equation, to build LNG import facilities, and then also to cultivate its oil exploration activities outside the country. I think by some estimates, the Chinese national oil companies have spent close to $9 billion over a short period of time trying to access and develop oil resources around the world that contribute approximately 2 million barrels a day to their overall consumption these days. So it's really followed the rules of the game in terms of diversity, which is diversify your suppliers. And then it carries that diversity theme through in terms of its own domestic energy policies, which is trying to encourage alternative and diverse sources of fuels consumed at home, not only for security purposes, but also for environmental purposes as well. It's a really important question. You know, when you look at a 1% delta in terms of Chinese GDP growth rate in either direction, that 1% change in their GDP growth rate can translate into the energy consumption of a large country like Brazil, right? It is not inconsequential. So Chinese growth, how they tie energy consumption to its growth, how the structure of the Chinese economy exists going forward are all probably some of the largest questions shaping international energy markets going forward. I think one of the big questions right now is whether or not the Chinese economic slowdown will yield some sort of response on the Chinese side that has them go back to some sort of energy-intensive stimulus spending, whether it's infrastructure projects or looking to export more products abroad that are energy intensive, whether it's cement or steel or any of those sorts of things, or use them domestically for some of those large infrastructure projects. I think that kind of impact might raise consumption of raw materials and fuels in China for a period of time, but it could have an effect on out-year growth, several years down the line when the stimulus wears off. And so I think both of those efforts to stimulate the economy, but also very importantly, the efforts that the Chinese government has pursued in earnest for a good long period of time to increase energy efficiency and the energy intensity of the economy, all are really, really important to watch in terms of the energy demand coming from China. I think, the Chinese have surprised a lot of people in that they set out very aggressive targets. When the targets look too aggressive, they revise them a bit downward. But what setting aggressive targets has meant, to the global renewable energy market is quite astonishing. I think the fact that the Chinese have been able to grow their solar capacity and their wind capacity to the extent that they have has made China one of the largest, if not the largest, market for renewable energy technologies and services around the world. I think that one of the challenges that China has had is connecting all of that renewable energy power generation to the sources of consumption. And so that's why you're seeing companies like State Grid and others creating these long sort of transmission lines and plans to connect some of these resources from the big sort of renewable energy production centers to some of the consumption centers in the country. I think that one of the things that is going to continue to be a challenge for Chinese renewables is for them to be able to get sort of deeply incorporated into urban planning and cities, and where a huge amount of the landscape, the sort of energy demand going forward is coming from. And so I think China in some ways has a lot of the same kind of challenges that other countries do with large pre-exist built infrastructure, which is trying to make it more efficient and incorporate renewable energy use into those plannings and those systems. So one of the big things that China is undertaking is electricity reform and pricing reform on the energy side. And I think one of the really main challenges that it has is being able to allow renewables to compete equitably within the electric power sector. And so electricity liberalization, that pricing reform on the fuel side, there's a lot of things that that China can do in terms of how its electric power market functions to be able to encourage more renewables to be able to get into the mix. I think China is a real leader when it comes to South-South energy and climate discussions. I think within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the sort of global body responsible dealing with the global climate challenge, China has made a really big shift this year. They went from being kind of the leader of the G77, the developing country group, where they were seen as being obstructionists to the larger sort of effort to get all countries around the world to play a role in reducing emissions. That's not clearly how the Chinese saw it. They saw themselves as being defenders of the developing countries that should get compensated or at least assistance in terms of reducing their emissions and adapting to a changing climate. I think this year the Chinese basically took a different kind of leadership role, recognizing that their development status has changed and that their ability to affect both the politics of climate change, but also offer assistance in terms of deploying clean energy technology and really wanting to be a leader in that space has been a really significant shift, in terms of how the Chinese perceive themselves as a leader in this area. I think at the Paris climate talks, the Chinese announced a $3 billion commitment to climate finance, which is the first large developing economy to make such a sizable commitment. But it was really only for South-South giving. It wasn't necessarily, within the context of the OECD economies and the sort of the OECD economy financing structure. It was something different. It was setting up a new pot of money, perhaps with some, new areas of giving in terms of clean energy financing for the least developed economies in the world. I think added on to that, you've got initiatives like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the South-South bilateral investment banks and development banks that China has really been spearheading. I think we'll have to wait and see how much of that has a clean energy agenda to it. But I think that certainly when you think about some of the major infrastructure and investment projects that are needed in the energy space around the world, that clearly China will be trying to play a role in fulfilling that investment, especially with AIIB looking at Asia in terms of the infrastructure investment that they need. Most of that, if not directly energy related, certainly has an impact on energy consumption in that region of the world.